Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us here on Ask the Agronomist this morning. Got Dan Shaw with me today. Adam Henniger is traveling today, so safe travels to Adam. And Dan was good enough to come in and be fill-in producer this morning. We're going to spend most of the morning talking about that long list of things there behind me on the board that you probably can't read. And those things are all related to high yield management. So we've got yield chasers coming up here, our contest. There's Adam tight taps and then Sean, production manager today. Yep. Okay. All right. So be safe, Adam, in your travels. So quit texting and driving if you are. So anyway, we've got Yield Chaser Banquet coming up next week, and Yield Chasers is our yield contest. We've talked about that here on Ask the Agronomist lots of times. And thanks, Dan. And since Yield Chasers is a yield contest, and we're going to be celebrating people who entered the contest and achieved some fabulous yields, I thought maybe we'd spend some time talking about if you want to try to chase for some higher yields in 2023, what are some of the things that you might want to do differently in your management if you're trying to achieve, set yourself a goal. And I would, I arbitrarily picked the goal of raising 350 bushel corn and 100 bushel soybeans. So everything we talk about here this morning is going to be with that goal in mind of 350 corn, 100 bushel soybeans. I'll take a sip here. Still getting over a cold. So this broadcast could not have occurred like on Saturday or Sunday, but luckily we missed the worst of my cold. So the first thing I've got on my list up here is field selection. So we all know every field's different. You know what your fields typically do. If you're going to enter a yield contest, you might as well start by picking the best field that you typically have. So let's assume that if the field is normally your best under normal management, it would also be the best place to try to raise a new record yield for your farm. So that's the first place I would start. I'd also consider the size of the field. So if it's a 15-acre patch, probably not going to be big enough to do all the things I'm going to suggest you do to give yourself the best odds of winning the contest. It doesn't need to be a 240-acre field, but I'd say an 80 or thereabouts would be a good size to work in. It probably ought to have easy access as well. So the number of times you're going to go visit this field during the growing season, the number of times you're potentially going to make an application in this field, the amount of scouting and watching you're going to be doing in this field. If it's the hardest field in your operation to get to, that's going to be kind of a pain for you going through the season. And then lastly would be crop rotation. So if you're trying to raise 100 bushel soybeans, really nice to follow multiple years of corn. So the first thing I would tell you is if you're going to try to win a soybean yield contest, you will help yourself if you've got some fields that haven't been in soybeans for a while. Matter of fact, I've always thought there should be a different category for those acres because 85 bushel soybeans in a 50-50 rotation is way more impressive to me than 100 bushel soybeans following 5 years of corn. But if you do have that field that you can choose to work in that's had multiple years of corn, in fact, I'll give you a little tip. If you want to get serious about winning soybean yield contests, you probably need to start doing some longer term corn on a few fields in rotation so that every year you've got a field that's been in corn for 3 or 4 years that you can put your high yield soybean plot into. So just a tip. And then on the corn side, I'd prefer to stay rotated, corn. So I'd be on a first year cornfield for my corn yield contest. Seed selection next. So obviously, every company sells seed that can excel in high yield environments, but not every hybrid excels the same as another in a high yield environment. And if you're going to decide what hybrids or varieties you're going to do for your high yield field, I would be selecting for products that have done well in a high yield environment. And any seed company worth its salt should be able to sort their data for you and tell you, well, these are what have done the best for us in our trials and our plots in a 300 plus bushel yield environment for corn or a 90 plus bushel yield environment for soybeans. And I'll give a little shout out to ourselves here for the year that DeKalb brand had in NCGA yield contest. We had probably the best year we've ever had in that contest. And if you look at those results, you'll see DKC popping up lots of times in there. So thanks to all of our customers that participate in the NCGA yield contest. With Yield Chasers, we make it a little easier than NCGA does, but we encourage our Yield Chaser contestants to also enter NCGA. And if you meet the NCGA requirements, you're far exceeding the Yield Chaser requirements to entry. Now, if you choose the easy route that we allow with Yield Chasers, that will not qualify you for NCGA. So if you want to do both, which is what we encourage, you need to know what the rules and requirements are for an NCGA yield contest entry. One thing I would suggest, and this is what the big boys do, it's a lot of work and it requires more acres, but most of the guys that are winning year in and year out consistently in NCGA contests plant several different hybrids in their contest on their contest acres. You know, we all know that we do the best we can to pick the hybrid that's going to win every year, but we never know what hybrid's going to win every year. And so if you plant 2 hybrids, that doubles your odds of having the right one. If you plant 3, 4, 5, 6, you know, if you've got a field that's big enough to, you know, you're going to need, I'm going to say at least 15 acres of each different hybrid. So again, if you want to plant multiple hybrids, that's going to increase the size of the field that you need to be working in. You probably don't want to plant just 5 acres of each hybrid, because then you don't have very many acres to choose from where you're doing your yield check. But if you can lay a field out so that you can get 3 or 4 different hybrids planted in blocks, that just increases your odds of having the hybrid that has a kick-ass year, and that's the one you're going to want to enter the contest with. Planting date. So we get wrapped around the axle every year about, I got to get the crop in early. We've talked a lot about planting date relative to soybeans being frankly more important than it is relative to corn. So I would say timely planting would be more important than early planting. And we'll talk about soil conditions here in a bit, but seeding conditions and field conditions are far more important, in my opinion, than planting date is, particularly on corn. If you want to push it early with something for your yield contest, I would suggest doing that with beans, not with your corn. So I would, I'd be targeting, sometime in late April, early May for that corn planting date, whenever field conditions are perfect. Probably not much advantage to being earlier than April 20th. But if field conditions are perfect earlier than that, nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong with your corn for your yield contest getting planted in May either. I'd like it to be early in May. Now, soybeans, on the other hand, probably be nice to have them in ideally before April 25th, if possible. But in both cases, watch your field conditions. Rushing stuff, mudding stuff in, being out there a day or two early is not a good way to set yourself up to win a yield contest. I had a question in here. What about multiple planting dates? So if you really want to go crazy with this, you could have multiple planting dates as well, because we also know that planting date can impact yield, but we don't exactly know what planting window is going to be the highest yielding one. So if you got lots of acres, lots of room, lots of time, and you want to get really crazy, your mind kind of explodes when you think about, gosh, if I'm going to have multiple hybrids and multiple planting dates, and that gets really, really, really complex. And we're probably just scratching the surface of some of the tricks of the trade that the big boys use that win these contests every year. And I'm no I'm no David Hula or Randy Dowdy. If you're working with one of those guys, they've got lots more tips than I'm going to give you here. So we'll talk about seeding rate a little bit while we're talking about seeding. And this is an area that gets a little controversial for a seed company because we're always accused of pushing seeding rates just to sell more seed. We're pushing seeding rates to get more yield is why we're pushing seeding rates. And if you're getting more yield, you're going to make more money even at a higher seeding rate. So we talked a couple episodes ago about all the population research we do and trying to hit that, highest economic return point for your seeding. I will tell you that kind of goes out the window if you're trying to win a yield contest. So I think you all understand that, if you pick an 80 and you treat it differently than the rest of your farm, and this 80 is your playground for the yield contest, you're going to do things on that 80 that you don't do on your other 1,000 acres of corn. Now, you may learn some things playing around on that high yield 80 that you adopt on your other 1,000 acres of corn over time. But I will, this is probably a bit of an overstatement, but I would be pretty surprised if there was any winning entries in the NCGA yield contest planted under 40,000 seeds per acre. And there's probably some winning entries in there that were planted over 50,000 seeds per acre, even if you're in a 30-inch row. So the higher you can go, the higher you can manage, the higher you can stand. Do not be afraid to push seeding rates. Remember, we're going for 350 plus bushels here, and you're not going to get there with 36,000 plants. So do the math on how big your ear size would have to be to achieve 350 bushel with 36,000 ears. That's not going to happen no matter how you manage that crop. So population is probably one of the main things that's preventing people from achieving super high yields, on normal acres. Now, you have to have the management to go with the population, and you have to understand that with pushing population, you're increasing your risk of lodging, you're increasing your risk of green snap, you're increasing your risk of root lodging. You are also increasing your odds of raising 350 bushel corn, which is kind of the point if you want to take on these kind of challenges. So seeding rate's important. With soybeans, might be just the opposite. There's a bit of a school of thought that high yield soybeans, early planted soybeans, high management soybeans, you should probably reduce your seeding rate. So I would challenge you to get uncomfortably low on your soybeans, and you might call uncomfortably low 140,000. Somebody else might call uncomfortably low 80,000. But whatever is uncomfortably low for you on soybeans is probably about where I would be. And uncomfortably high for you on corn is where I would ask you to be. Uniformity of emergence is key in both crops, not just corn. Probably more important in corn than it is in soybeans, but we've also seen that when you've got that spindly, runty soybean growing next to its neighbors that's not really contributing much to yield, that's not doing any favors for your soybean yields either. So having those good soil conditions, having that planter operating perfectly, having relatively warm soils so that you get quick emergence. Cold soils, even if you do the best job planting with the best seed and everything is the best you can make it, cold soils result in uneven emergence because cold soils are not uniformly cold. There's going to be spots where it's a little warmer, spots where it's a little wetter, spots where it's a little drier. And when seed is growing very, very, very slow, as it does when it's cold, that's when things get more spread out on you. That's the advantage that some of the guys that are in the South that always do well in the contest. They can plant early in a warm soil. They can plant timely in a warm soil. Everything they do always is in a warm soil. That's not the case for us. Sometimes our best spring soil conditions are when the soil is cold. And if moisture is more important than temperature, in my book, you can't plant when it's wet. You can plant when it's cold and dry. Now, I would rather plant when it's warm and dry, but cold and dry is probably better planting conditions than warm and wet. So sometimes you pick your poison. Question, Mr. Shaw.
Does row spacing make a difference with soybean and corn in a high yield environment where we are pushing the limit?
So, question was on row spacing. So, I would say probably makes more difference in corn than it does in soybeans. There's not a lot of data to support that higher seeding rates and narrow rows is going to gain you anything in soybeans. Narrow rows may, but if you go to a narrow row system in soybeans, you don't have to plant more plants. So you will cover the ground faster in narrow rows. And what we're trying to do with soybeans and corn for that matter is get the canopy as fast as we can. So 15-inch rows are going to get you canopy closure. 20-inch rows are going to get you canopy closure. Twin rows are going to get you canopy closure faster than standard 30-inch rows, but you don't have to increase your seeding rate in soybeans in those narrow row systems. On the corn side, what narrowing up enables you to do is push your populations higher. So I do think that there is, a possibility that in both crops there would be an advantage to narrow rows. And I do know that I don't know how often he does this, but I know from conversations I've had with Randy Dowdy over the years, Randy actually, there's been years he plants multiple different row configurations, multiple different row spacings, because it just kind of depends on the year, depends on the environment, which one's going to be the best. Most of us are not set up to do that. Most of us are not going to make a living by winning the NCGA yield contest, and it's probably not worth it to have multiple row spacings. You're going to do whatever you're set up to do. But I would tend to lean towards narrow rows because in corn I can probably increase my population even higher, and in soybeans I can get canopy closure quicker. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to out yield a traditional row spacing. So, talk about seed treatments a little bit. So obviously seed treatments are standard on corn. You would have a hard time buying untreated corn if you wanted to. Soybeans, the world is your oyster. You can buy, and this is typically what I recommend. I would recommend buying seed from your seed company and then let your dealer, who's set up in most cases to treat seed, I would let your dealer treat your seed because you can put whatever you want on it. If you order it treated from the factory, so to speak, they're going to do a nice job putting the treatment on, but you're going to be very limited in your options of what you could put in that treatment. So, inoculant is something that if I'm going to try to win a soybean yield contest, I want my soybeans inoculated. Well, you're not going to get inoculant with a factory treatment. If you want inoculant on your seed, you need to have a dealer put that treatment on because it needs to go on closer to planting. A lot of biological products that you can play with that can be added as a seed treatment. There is the opportunity to overtreat corn in some cases. That's a practice that the seed industry, frankly, is very uncomfortable with, but it's reality. We're going to have to get comfortable with it because people are going to do it. It does impact some of the guarantees that seed companies make on seed as far as quality and replanting, and certainly impacts your ability to return seed. So if you start over treating corn, be sure you know the rules from your seed supplier of how that impacts your ability to return the seed, and also does it impact the warranty that they make on the quality of that seed. But there's nutritional products you can put on seed. There's biological products you can put on seed. There's plant growth regulators you can put on seed. There's nematicides you can put on seed. Obviously, additional fungicide, insecticide can be put on seed. The base for me is going to be a good quality, high rate, fully loaded fungicide plus insecticide base on both corn and beans. And then you can go as crazy as you want to go from there, adding things to that treatment. And I would say this, as long as you don't add so much stuff to that seed that it messes up the plantability or it impacts the quality of the seed from a germination standpoint, the more the better. Give yourself as many odds as you can to get a benefit. Most of those products are not terribly expensive. They may help you, they may not, but as long as you're not going backwards, because of something you put on that seed, it's going to be neutral to positive, the benefit that product's going to have. So let's talk about soil environment for a minute. So, do you want to do the most amount of tillage you can do? Back when Francis Childs was winning the NCGA yield contest and the mini moldboard was all the rage. We had guys turning soil over that deep and making it felt like you were walking on a mattress walking across the field. Question, Dan?
Yeah. Are there specific micronutrients that should be considered for pushing the yield?
That caller is getting ahead. So when we get into fertility, that's we're on number 6 now. Fertility's number 9. Got 13 things on my list, so that's coming up. Good question. If I don't address that adequately, remind me of that, Dan. So, so from a soil environment, do you want to do no-till? There are specific categories in NCGA for no-till, ridge-till, conventional tillage, and so in some cases you're only going to be competing against growers that are in the same system you're in. What I would say is, regardless of what kind of tillage system you do, you need to minimize traffic and you need to minimize compaction, especially close to the seed trench, right there in the root zone when that seed is getting started. You should do nothing in that field when soils are too wet. And do nothing means what it says what you think it means. So don't be spraying, don't be planting, don't be doing tillage, don't be side dressing, don't even walk out there when it's too wet. You don't want to do anything in the field when it's too wet. And that's a challenge for us here in the Midwest. And that's one of the reasons it's harder to, it's probably easier to win some of these contests if you're outside the Corn Belt, frankly. If you've got access to irrigation and the management it takes to raise high yielding corn, and you've got warm soils and you have the ability to feed that plant everything that it desires, and you're not relying on your soil to provide everything to that plant that it desires, we're sometimes at a disadvantage here because it's too wet, frankly. And every day that it's too wet in your field, you're losing yield because of that. And we can't stop it from raining. We can do a better job draining fields, but we can't control the weather. And when we get too much moisture, that's a detriment for us. And so sometimes areas that are dry, that have access to irrigation, those guys are tough to beat in some of these contests. Now, if you're entering a local contest like our Yield Chaser contest here in Central Illinois, most of us here in Central Illinois don't have irrigation. And so we're all kind of in the same boat when it comes to being at the mercy of Mother Nature. And I would also say, just in general, select fields with good drainage and know where your tile lines are. We'll talk about that here when we get down to the harvest part. But when you start deciding where you're going to pull your yield check from, it'd be good to know where the tile lines are. And if you are able to plant the field so that you're planting in the same direction or parallel with your tile lines and you know where they are, good chance that the rows that are planted right above the tile line are often going to be the best. So it might be to your advantage to know where those tile lines are. Residue management. So if regardless of how much tillage you're doing, you'll probably want to try to get faster residue decomposition. So in these contest fields, you might want to be doing some extra treatments in the fall. You might want to be trying to get these fields harvested early. That's another trick I would say. If you're picking fields, I tend to lean towards your fields that got harvested first the year before, because that residue is a lot more decomposed in those fields than the last field that you harvested the year before. So managing that residue and thinking ahead, you might want to be trying to do some things to enhance the decomposition of that residue in your contest field. You got 2 choices with residue. You either bury it or move it. The last place you want any residue is in the seed trench. So you can either move it to the side with some good row cleaners and leave it on the surface. Doesn't bother me a bit. You can bury it, get it out of the way. That's the way you choose to do it. That's fine too. What you don't want to do is go out there and vertical till the heck out of the field and create a layer of soil and residue mix that's about 2 inches deep. And then when you're planting, you can't move that residue out of your way with your row cleaners because it's blended into the top couple inches of soil. That's fabulous for decomposition, but that's not particularly good for seed to soil contact. So you do however you decide to manage your residue, make sure that you're not creating a seed zone that has a lot of residue in it. You either want the residue deep, or you want the residue on top, or you want the residue gone. And that's all I'll say on that. So weed control, this will be quick. So we want zero weed competition season long. So if you're using a pre-emergence program up front, you want to prevent as much early season weed growth as you can, because early season weed competition absolutely saps yield from corn worse than soybeans, but it saps them both. If you're doing a post program, you want to spray those weeds when they're small so you don't give them time to compete. You also want to spray those weeds when they're small because it allows you to use safer chemistry, lower rates of chemistry, and the smaller your crop is when you spray it, the less likely you are to stress that crop from a herbicide standpoint. So we don't ever want to be making late post applications in a yield contest field, even though late post applications might be labeled and might be fine under normal circumstances. If you're trying to raise 350 bushel corn, you don't want to be pushing the label on any herbicide product, even Roundup. So the early post applications, use the safest programs you can use. Don't push the label. Don't push the rates. Keep the field clean. Those are kind of some of the best rules of thumb that we can do. Soybeans is probably a little trickier than corn, because if you want to use a really good pre up front to keep your beans as clean as you can, some of those products tend to stress the beans a little bit more. Early planting stresses the beans a little bit more, and we've talked a lot about this on Ask the Agronomist in the past. That combination of cold soils, herbicide, and heavy residue can make for a pretty tough environment for soybeans and can slow their growth. I'm not saying that it reduces their yield potential, but it does slow their growth, and we're trying to get that early canopy in soybeans. It does seem a little counterproductive. But pulling those pre's out, letting the weeds come crashing through, letting the weeds choke out your beans, and putting more pressure on your post-emergence weed control program is not a good solution to the problem either. So we're still trying to figure out, how do we get really good, effective, economical, manageable season-long soybean weed control with no stress to the plant. That's virtually impossible to do today. It was easy to do for about 15 years in the heyday of the Roundup Ready system, but times have changed, and we got to rely on all the tools in the toolbox. And some of those tools are hammers, and sometimes we hammer that crop a little bit to get us the level of weed control that we need to have. So, Adam, we're coming up on fertility management here. So fertility management could be a whole episode in and of itself. So we're already halfway through this episode, so we're going to have to shortchange some of this stuff. I've got an interesting chart here that I'm going to refer to. Adam, some of your research work is what's driving that chart, by the way. So when it comes to fertility, it's all about nutrient, timing, amount, and placement. So what nutrients do I need? When do I need to apply them? How much do I need to apply? And where should I place it? Should I band it? Should it go on pre-plant? Should it go on side dress? There's a myriad of different options of things you can apply. So our macronutrients, obviously nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. Those are the big four, in my opinion. And then probably the next two, and the question about micronutrients, The two micronutrients that have probably been researched the most, that are the most understood, that are needed in the most amount by the crop would be zinc and boron. Zinc probably more important for corn, boron probably more important for soybeans. We'll talk some numbers here in a minute, and you'll understand why we call those micronutrients and why sulfur is actually a macronutrient that gets mislabeled as a micronutrient by lots of people. Now, it is the least, it is the macronutrient that is used in the least amount compared to N, P, and K, and it's used in far lower amounts than N, P, and K. But sulfur is not a micronutrient. Sulfur is a macronutrient, and sulfur is just as important as the other macronutrients. Actually, it might be more important than the other macronutrients because it's probably the macronutrient that we manage the poorest typically. So we'll talk more about sulfur. So you might ask, do I need to apply nitrogen on soybeans? We'll see in a minute how much nitrogen soybeans use. It's a tremendously high nitrogen demand crop. Now that surprises people because soybeans are a legume, right? So being a legume means they're fixing their own nitrogen, which they do a marvelous job of fixing nitrogen, but they can't fix all they need. So they are using a tremendous amount of nitrogen from the soil. And in theory, if you're trying to raise 80 plus bushel soybeans consistently, it's going to be difficult for those soybeans to fix and scavenge all the nitrogen they need. Now, that being said, I don't know of anyone who has had consistent, wonderful results getting a economical level of yield increase applying nitrogen to soybeans. But again, if we're trying to win a yield contest, economics is not the first and foremost thing that we're concerned about. Obviously, you may not adopt, every practice that you use in your high yield field, you may not adopt for your entire operation, because then economics are extremely important. But we can kind of do what we want in our contest field. So, nitrogen on soybeans, there's a lot of different theories on how to do it, when to do it, what products to use. Might be something you want to play with, for your yield contest. So the question about, do I need micros? So the plant absolutely needs micros, and we're going to talk in a minute about what the plant needs. So there are essential elements that are macros. There are essential elements that are micros. So there's a lot of essential elements. The reason they're micro doesn't mean they're less important, doesn't mean they're less essential, just means the plant needs a lot less of them. So the question is, does the plant need micros? Absolutely, the plant needs micros. Every plant needs micros every year. Do you need to apply more? Sometimes. And I would say if you're trying to yield 350 bushel corn, 100 bushel soybeans, you're trying to prevent hidden hunger, you're trying to give that plant everything it needs every day of its life, you're probably going to want to apply some micros. Do I need late side dress applications in corn? So that's another thing that's kind of popular in some circles where guys are trying to win yield contests. They're putting on nitrogen after tassel. I'm not a big fan of nitrogen after tassel. If you have the ability to put one more shot of nitrogen on in the late vegetative stage, maybe close to tassel, it's not going to hurt anything to make sure that plant doesn't run short of nitrogen. But by the time corn pollinates, it's taken up almost all the nitrogen it's going to take up for that year. So it doesn't require near as much nitrogen after tasseling as it does before. So keep that in mind. I don't think it's absolutely critical to get late season nitrogen on. If you're concerned that you're short, if you're concerned that you lost some, if you just want to have some extra cushion on to make sure that you don't run short, maybe there's a place for that. But certainly making in-season applications of nitrogen is good. It's a good option to have. I don't necessarily think you need to be making season-long applications of nitrogen. And by the time we get to tassel, I would say you should be done applying nitrogen, because keep in mind, the nitrogen is not available to the plant the day you put it on. So the nitrogen that you put on a tassel, it might be a month before it's available to that plant in some cases, depending on placement, depending on nitrogen form, depending on the weather. And so, when you put it on a tassel, it's going to be around long after tassel for that plant to use up. So I'll ask you a question. Have any of you ever applied a 400, 350, so 400 pounds of DAP, 350 pounds of potash for a 2-year spread on a farm? Probably haven't done that. That's actually the usage of 350 bushel corn and 100 bushel soybeans. So I'm going to ask you not to make a 2-year spread. So I probably shouldn't use a 2-year spread analogy, but I know a lot of people think in terms of 2-year spreads. I'm going to ask you to quit doing 2-year spreads. I'm going to ask you to spread fertilizer every year for every crop and quit combining those 2 years together. But let's talk about usage a little bit. So when I talk about nutrient usage, there's kind of 2 ways you can look at it. You can look at how much does the crop need to be able to find, and how much will it remove. The amount it needs to be able to find is a lot more than the amount that's going to get removed in the grain. So the amount that's left in the stalks and the roots and the leaves and all the stover that's left out in the field, that's going to cycle back to you. The only part that actually leaves and is not coming back to you is the part that leaves in the grain. So plants need to be able to find a tremendous amount more of nutrient than they're going to remove from your field. So for example, the amount of nitrogen it takes to a corn plant takes up per bushel of production is 1.11 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of yield is what it's going to take up. What's actually leaving in the grain is only 0.64 pounds. So a little more than half of the nitrogen that corn plant's going to need to support itself during its life, if it's raising 350 bushel corn, is going to leave the field in the grain. A lot of that stays behind and the plant gets cycled back. Phosphorus, pretty high percentage of the phosphorus that corn plants take up leaves. That means it has a high harvest index, so that's why phosphorus is pretty critical to corn. But if you just do the math on, and I've done the math here, it's kind of hard for you guys to see that. I'll hold it there for just a second. But I'll read you these figures if you want to jot them down. So again, this is for 350 bushel corn. A 350 bushel corn crop is going to take up 390 pounds of nitrogen. It's going to remove 224 pounds of nitrogen. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to put on 390. Maybe you don't even need to put on 224 because the soil is going to supply a lot of nitrogen. So you do not have to apply all of the nitrogen that the corn plant needs. Your decision as the manager is to decide, am I going to put on half and count on the soil to provide half? Am I going to put on 3/4 and let the soil provide a quarter? What am I going to trust the soil to give me versus what am I going to put out there to make sure that the plant's not short? Phosphorus. So this is in terms of P2O5, which, for example, DAP is 46% P2O5. So I'll give you the amount of actual elemental phosphorus. So uptake for 350 bushel corn is 154 pounds of elemental phosphorus, which translates to 335 pounds of DAP. You ever put on 335 pounds of DAP for 1 year for one crop? Probably not. The removal is actually 123 pounds of elemental phosphorus, which is 267 pounds of DAP. So, if you do variable rate spreading, I've put on, 250 pounds of DAP per acre for one crop doing variable rate spreading in those parts of my field that yielded 325. Potassium, potassium is a huge uptake nutrient for corn, but a fairly low removal nutrient for corn. So I think this is a miss on our part. We think potassium is less important for corn because it removes relatively little because there's not much in the grain. But to produce that plant, takes a lot of potassium. Now, most of it cycles back because most of it does not leave the field in the corn stalks. But that plant needs to be able to find a lot of potassium to achieve its potential. So uptake on potassium for 350 bushel corn, 274 pounds per acre of elemental potassium. That's 120 pounds more than the phosphorus uptake. Now, removal is only 88 pounds of elemental potassium. So that equates to uptake 457 pounds to the acre of potash, but removal is only 147 pounds per acre of potash. So that plant absolutely needs to be able to find a quarter ton almost of potash, but it's only going to remove 147 pounds. Sulfur. So this is a big miss I think a lot of people are making. So uptake on sulfur for 350 bushel corn, 35 pounds per acre. Removal is actually 21 pounds per acre. So if you put that in terms of ammonium thiosulfate, which is the way a lot of people put on sulfur, and I talked to a lot of guys that use, 3-gallon, 5-gallon, it's going to remove the equivalent of 7-gallon per acre of ATS. It's going to take up the equivalent of 12 gallons to the acre of ATS. And keep in mind with sulfur is like nitrogen. Sulfur is a mobile nutrient in the soil. Your soil cannot hold sulfur. Sulfur is going to leach. Sulfur is going to go where the water goes. And if the water's moving through your soil, the sulfur is moving through your soil. The only reason there's always sulfur in your soil is because it's being mineralized out of the organic matter. But your soil does not naturally hold any sulfur. So you should probably be supplying, I'm going to say for a high yield corn crop, a minimum of 25 pounds of sulfur per year. And that's more sulfur than most people are using. While we're on sulfur real quick, I'll call out the fact that soybeans use about 80% as much sulfur as corn does. And there's virtually nobody that's paying any attention to sulfur on soybeans. So the sulfur that you apply to your corn crop's going to use it, or it's going to be lost from the soil. It's not going to be left hanging around for your soybeans to get 2 years later. So sulfur is a primary reason that I wish we would do 1-year spreads, not 2-year spreads. We can do a lot better job addressing our sulfur needs. Now, you can use elemental sulfur. Elemental sulfur does break down slowly. So if you put elemental sulfur on this year, it's not all going to be broken down in the following year. Some of it's still going to be breaking down in year 2, maybe even year 3. So if you use a bunch of elemental sulfur, you can slowly extend the availability of that sulfur. The trick with elemental sulfur is it's not particularly beneficial to this year's crop because it's not going to be available when that crop needs it. So some combination of sulfate along with elemental sulfur is probably the best way to manage sulfur. You've got some that's available now. You've got some that'll be available later. So we'll jump into our micros here. So zinc would be the largest micro for corn. Now you're only going to uptake 0.67 pounds, so 2/3 of a pound. So compare, 390 pounds of nitrogen, 154 pounds of phosphorus, 274 pounds of potassium, 35 pounds of sulfur, 2/3 of a pound of zinc. That's why we call them micros, because it is needed in far, far, far less amounts. The removal rate of zinc is only 0.4 of a pound. So can you imagine in 350 bushels of grain, there's only 0.42 pounds of zinc. So you don't have to put on a lot of these micronutrients, but you probably want to be thinking about putting on some of them. Boron, even less. Boron is, like I say, based on usage, more important to soybeans than it is to corn. But the uptake on boron in 350 bushels of corn, the uptake is only a little over 1/10 of a pound. The removal is 0.029 pounds. So 3/100 of a pound of boron in 350 bushels of grain. So once again, micronutrients. So let's look at soybeans. So nitrogen is probably the mind blower on soybeans. So you may have heard that it takes about 4 pounds of nitrogen to raise a bushel of soybeans. That's true. So if you do the math on that, if it takes 4 pounds per bushel, how many pounds of nitrogen is a 100 bushel soybean crop going to take up? Yep, 408 pounds. So a little trivia question for you. Which crop needs more nitrogen, corn or soybeans? Soybeans. Dan Shaw got it right. So that's that surprises people. You know, the soybean is going to fix a lot of its own nitrogen. It can't. I don't care how good your inoculant is. The soybean crop can't fix 400 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So the soybean crop is going to use all of the nitrogen that's in the soil. That's why there is no such thing as a soybean credit. We've talked about that before. We'll talk about it again, but we're not going to talk about it today. The removal rate of nitrogen for soybeans is 300 pounds per acre. So, you know, a lot of protein in soybeans. What makes protein? Nitrogen. So soybeans remove a tremendous amount of nitrogen. Once again, that's why there's no credit. They took the nitrogen with them. They didn't leave it behind for the corn crop. Phosphorus, less important in total pounds. However, Dr. Bilo has called out many times the harvest index for phosphorus is extremely high. Most of the phosphorus that the soybean plant takes up, even though it's not taking up a ton of it, is leaving in the grain along with that nitrogen in that protein. So Dr. Bilo has discovered that phosphorus is probably more critical to high yield soybeans than maybe we have previously thought. So 72 pounds of P is the uptake, 58 pounds of P is removal. That equates to 157 pounds of DAP uptake and 126 pounds of DAP removal. So so your 350 bushel corn removed 267 pounds of DAP, and your 100 bushel soybeans removed 126 pounds of DAP. So you do the math on that. That's your 400 pounds of DAP removal in that 2-year rotation. Potash is crazy amount of potash removed by soybeans, especially on the uptake. So 472 pounds of potash uptake. So I see lots of potash deficiency symptoms in corn. I see lots of potash deficiency symptoms in soybeans every year. That's because if you're raising high yield corn and high yield soybeans, you're uptaking almost a half a ton of potash, you know, in a 2-year period. So 457 on corn, 472 on soybeans is the uptake. The removal on the soybeans is 195 pounds of potash. So soybeans are going to remove 100 bushel soybeans removes a lot more potash than 350 bushel corn does. And they both have huge uptake requirements for potash. We already talked about sulfur on soybeans being pretty important. So the numbers relative to corn uptake was 35, soybeans uptakes 28. That's again for 100 bushel soybeans. Removal, 21 for corn, 17 for soybeans. So as you can see, soybeans are needing and removing almost as much sulfur as corn is, and we're probably not even thinking at all about sulfur when it comes to soybeans in many cases, and that's something that I think we should change. Zinc and soybeans, uptake 1/2 pound, removal 0.2 pounds. So uptake is fairly similar to corn, 2/3 pound versus 1/2 pound, but the removal is twice as much for corn as it is for soybeans. So again, the harvest index for zinc is higher in corn. Dr. Bilo's opinion, his research would indicate that the nutrients that have the highest harvest index are the ones that you are most likely to see a positive yield response from applications of those nutrients. In soybeans, boron uptake is fairly high, so about 1/2 pound as well, compared to a little over 1/10 pound uptake for corn. Now the removal rate is higher as well. close to 0.2 of a pound removal for a 100 bushel soybean crop versus 0.03 of a pound removal for corn. So again, boron is a bigger deal from a nutrient standpoint on legumes, and we used to only worry about boron in alfalfa, where it's even more important to alfalfa than it is to soybeans. So to review the fertility section here, what we're trying to do is enhance availability. Okay, thanks, Dan. And reduce or overcome immobilization of those nutrients. And immobilization is when that nutrient becomes unavailable to the plant. We want to prevent hidden hunger. Hidden hunger is when that plant is short on a nutrient, but it's not deficient enough that you see symptomology. But if that plant's short on a nutrient, you're not going to maximize its yield. And I would say fertility is probably the area that yield contest winners have focused on the most. And we, traditional fertility programs do not feed the crop well enough to maximize its yield potential. And so, I would argue that if you've never used these amounts of fertilizer and you've never used some of these forms of fertilizer and you've never applied some of these nutrients, that's going to be restricting your yield potential. Talk about fungicide real quick. So we want to generally be aggressive with rates and number of applications. If you look at the fungicide regimes of a lot of yield contest winners, they're just spraying fungicide on a schedule throughout the whole growing season. You may not have to do that, but I mean, you can put fungicides on with the planter. You can put fungicides on early vegetative, like a V5, V6 application in corn, or a R1 application in soybeans. You can put stuff on late vegetative. So there's pre-tassel fungicide going on. I'm not a big fan of that myself in that late vegetative stage, but there are people that are doing that. You've got early reproductive, which is the sweet spot in corn, that VT to R1. And then mid to late reproductive, we're seeing benefits to another shot of fungicide in some cases after that VTR1 application. So there's really, there are limits. You do need to, abide by labels. That's something that some yield contest participants are probably overlooking a little bit. You don't want to be exceeding the maximum label allowed amount of any product that you're using. So be cognizant of that. But if you're trying to win a yield contest, don't skimp on the fungicide. Non-traditional products, so things like biostimulators and bioenhancers, plant growth regulators, yield contest fields are great places to try new things. Sometimes it's hard to isolate where the yield's coming from. When you throw everything but the kitchen sink at a crop and it yields 330, you don't really know how much yield came from everything that was in the kitchen sink. So it can sometimes be a challenge to isolate, okay, what was the advantage from this particular product, unless you do some pretty elaborate trials. But if you're going to try something, you might as well be trying it in your contest field. Let's talk about in-season monitoring. So frequent scouting is going to be a key. A lot of people do tissue testing in contest fields. Tissue testing is really helpful if you've got irrigation, because every time you run the pivot, you can put nutrients on. Most of us do not have access to an irrigation pivot to spoon feed on nutrients with our irrigation water through the growing season. So that's a disadvantage that we have, but there can still be benefits to tissue testing to fine tune your soil fertility program. Maybe it will cause you to make a side dress application. Maybe you'll want to do a foliar application of some kind. So I would still encourage some level of tissue testing. I'm not sure it has to be done weekly, but there are people that get really anal about their tissue testing. They do it the same day of the week, every week, same part of the field, same time of the day, same lab every time, and they graph over time those results that they get, and they can correlate that over years and years and years to the yields that they've achieved, and believe that they know the actual amount of nutrient that needs to be in that plant every day of its life to achieve a 400 or a 450 or a 500 or whatever their yield goal is. I would also utilize imagery. Imagery can help you see things in your field that your eyes can't see. And so whether it's satellite imagery, whether it's fixed wing aerial imagery, whether it's drone based imagery, whatever imagery source you choose to use, I would absolutely add that to my list of things, because you will pick up things from that imagery that you can't see walking through the field. So it's another layer of information that would be good to have. And now we're up to harvest here. So so harvest strategies, I would utilize imagery again to identify the sweet parts of that field. So there's a couple different ways you can do that. If you're not using imagery, you can harvest, lay off lands and yield each, every time you cut through the field or you break out a new land, take a yield of that strip, and you just hunt, pick around, and find the highest yielding part of that field to do your yield check in. That's not cheating. That's just playing the game and being smart is what that is. And you can use your imagery to do that too. Your field health image out of Climate, for example, or any of these other imagery sources will correlate very highly to a yield map. So without even driving a combine through a field, I can look at a field health image coming out of Climate pre-harvest. I can tell you where the best corn in the field is going to be. And I'll be right 95 times out of 100. And that's the spot you need to go and take your yield check. You need to know the size of the area required by the contest you're in for the yield check. So, with our Yield Chasers event, if you were using a field region report within Climate, we required a 10-acre block. NCGA, I think, is what, Dan, an acre and a quarter, I believe. And I think there are rules too as to, you can't, I don't know what the width has to be on that. It's got to be consecutive for sure. It's our contiguous. And if there are, you want to know those rules, because there's been people that have harvested a yield that they would have won, but they either didn't have a judge there to witness it, or they didn't have a scale to prove it, or they harvested it the wrong shape or the wrong size or the wrong way, and therefore did not qualify. So you want to know the rules. You want to harvest early to maximize yield. So nobody's going to win a yield contest picking 14% corn that dried in the field. You want to be taking that corn out at 27 or 28 to make sure that you're getting the maximum yield possible. You want to be cutting those soybeans tough as hell, burning up your separator belt on your combine, trying to slug those things through the machine. The first time you can get through a crop is typically the highest yield you're going to achieve. Now, combine settings and getting them all threshed and not running them out the tailings and all that stuff is comes with it too. So you got to make sure the combine's set right. You got to make sure things are operating correctly. But if the beans have been ready to cut for a month, you're losing yield. If the corn's been ready to pick for a month, you're losing yield. So be timely with your harvest. And harvest that crop when it's got some moisture in it. And then last and not least, remember your tile lines again. So if you're using, imagery to, pick the good spots, that's probably better than picking out the tile lines. But if you got a field that's got a tile line every 50 feet in it, pay a little bit of attention to the rows that are right above that tile line, or at least close to the tile line. They're going to frequently be better than the rows that are a greater distance away from the tile line. So that's my list. We could actually probably spend a lot more time on some of those topics. Hopefully we've given you some ideas of things that you might want to play around with this next year. If you want to do a yield contest, we're going into year 2 of our Yield Chaser program. Great success year 1, had great participation, expecting a great turnout for a Yield Chaser banquet. Even Dan has gotten kind of enthused with yield chasers. Dan was I can be a curmudgeon about things, and Dan was kind of a curmudgeon about doing a yield contest. But one of his growers won it, so maybe that's got something to do. Two of his growers won it, so maybe that's got something to do with why Dan is now a fan of yield contests. But we hope this thing grows. I'd love to see hundreds of entries this year in yield chasers. And I'd like to encourage as many of you as who are willing. I mean, NCGA it's a lot more work than just doing yield chasers. If you want to do it easy, yield chasers, we make that pretty easy. That climate field view region report option. Now it's going to be maybe a little harder to win that way because it's hard to get 10 acres of 350 bushel corn. It's easier to get an acre and a quarter of 350 bushel corn. But you don't need a judge. You don't need a scale. We're gonna trust you with yield chasers. NCGA ain't gonna trust you. You gotta prove it to them. So anyway, with that, thanks for your time and attention. We're at time here, so we'll go ahead and sign off. So next, what's 2 weeks from today, Dan?
You're pushing it.
Yeah, that's one of the producer responsibilities I forgot to tell Dan is.
2 weeks from today, be February 9th.
February 9th will be our next episode of Ask the Agronomist. So be thinking about your questions. It sounds like we got some winter coming back. We're getting ready. Our heifers start calving February 10th. So you can bet it'll be below zero on February 10th. But anyway, thanks for being here, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Take care.